So here's my dilemma before I get into this review. Does it count as a spoiler if it's literally spoiled in the thumbnail picture on Disney+? Hello interwebs, I hope you're all doing well because I am here to review the 4th episode of Daredevil Born Again. This episode titled, and let me make sure I get my Latin correct, Sic Semper Systema. And I want to talk about that title in just a second, but this is a very interesting episode because this episode is just very much built on themes. We're not moving the plot forward a ton in this one, and I have very mixed feelings about that because on the one hand, a lot of the themes that this episode is dealing with are ones that I am very interested in, and I kind of talked about them a little bit in last week's review, but I'm even more feeling just how much this episode is seemingly trying to build a larger scale argument, but not inching forward the plot at all. Like this episode, I can tell that there's some stuff going on, but none of it feels like it's driving anywhere. And 4 episodes in at this point, I'm sort of like, where are we ultimately going? Like, I see things happening. I can see little bits and pieces of like, okay, I can kind of see that going somewhere. I can kind of see that going somewhere. And we ultimately get our first look at our big villain of the season. I believe his name is Muse. But still not really giving a big grand scope to like what's going on. And that is really difficult for a show that is both serialized and on episode 4. If I'm on episode 4 of a serialized show, I kind of want to know a little bit more about where we're heading, which is upsetting because I do like a lot of the ideas that this episode is playing with, and that kind of brings me back to the title, because obviously the title Sic Semper Systema is a play on the Latin phrase Sic Semper Tyrannis, which is sort of thus always unto tyrants or something like that, and it's sort of a reference to how tyrants sort of control things and take over. It sort of was a phrase used about Julius Caesar and things like that. And it was also used by John Wilkes Booth against Lincoln as well, who, seeing Lincoln as a tyrant by someone who was defending the South, that sort of thing. And so it's interesting that we're playing with systema here, which obviously means thus always unto systems. And this episode is very much getting onto how systems control our lives. And we get a lot of discussion in this episode about systems and how systems work from really interesting perspectives on both Matt's side and Fisk's side. And I'm really fascinated by that because they're really good questions. And really good insights, but I still don't know where we're going. But let's actually drill down to some specifics. I'm kind of staying general here. Let me start with Fisk, because I really liked the scene where he goes to that port and he's sort of like, we need to build up industry. And his aide essentially says, like, no, you can't do that. You have to, like, go to, you have to go to the board. You have to submit it onto the docket. And, like, all these things that get in his way of that he needs to follow the system in order to get through. And it's interesting that because ultimately what it seems like on the surface, now clearly there's some allusion to like Fisk has some other bosses or other sort of things that he's concerned about there by the guy that comes up at the end of that scene. But ultimately Fisk is trying to get something done, and it seems like it's ultimately a good for the town. Like, I want to build up industry, and he's being hamstrung by all this red tape, all of these systems. And that's curious to me, considering a lot of people have been talking about Fisk, and I myself have been talking about Fisk as a Trump allegory. And Trump is someone, if we're going to talk about it, is someone, regardless of your feelings on him, who is very much just ignoring all the red tape, ignoring how systems are going through, and no one's holding him accountable for that. Look at you Democrats. But ultimately, he's just a guy who's ignoring all the norms and systems in place and just does what he wants to do, and no one will punish him for it. He's learned that he cannot be punished for it. Here, though, Fisk is kind of like trying to get something done, and he's trying to play by the system. He's like, let's take that action. Let's go put ourselves on the docket. And trying to play by the rules and getting clearly very frustrated by the fact that he has to play by the rules and has to worry about public opinion. He has his young aide who let slip that he, is going to do this garbage scow thing to someone, one of the press girls at the bar at the beginning of the episode, who sort of reveals it, and he's sort of framed him as a union buster, sort of going around the unions to get like a tech company in there, which again has very Elon Musk vibes of like, oh, I'm going to work with this tech bro company to go around this sort of the unions here. But you could also see it from his perspective of like, oh, he's trying to, move things forward, work with a different thing disrupting the industry to try to help the city. Now, obviously, tech bros are not ultimately going to do that, and the episode isn't really interested in that, but we kind of can see this mindset that he has, that he's getting frustrated by the system. And then he's ultimately rewarding, because that moment where his aide sort of says, I understand you firing me, but I'm always going to be loyal. I'm always going to follow you. Like, you'll have my vote no matter what. And Fisk sort of being moved by that because he values loyalty, which is a very Trumpian trait. So it seems like the show is building up Fisk to not be a Trump figure right now, but sort of get into that Trump mindset of like, I'm just going to ignore the system, reward loyalty, you have that gangster sort of mob mentality that he's used so much elsewhere, even though he's trying to legitimize himself. And obviously there's something else going on in the background here, because we have that sort of stuff going on with, again, he has bosses above him. And I wanted to know more about that, because all of these ideas are really interesting. I like all of this stuff, but it's not moving the plot forward. And we get little hints of the plot, but nothing really happening. We also get stuff with Vanessa about like forgiveness and can he grow, and how he never understood her trauma from her childhood with her dad, stuff like that. And I like that, because it's sort of saying like, oh, he never really recognized that stuff, and he has it. We see at the end Adam, the person that she had an affair with, in a cage at the end. So he's still using brutal tactics and like not understanding how to really reconcile with complex emotions and complex feelings that his girlfriend would have around him, and it not being about him, and him just taking out his rage on some other guy, and sort of trying to understand that more complex nuance that he's not really getting, because he is somewhat more infantile, I think, in sort of his emotional understanding that we've seen throughout the entire series. So all of that stuff is fascinating and a good character study of Fisk, but there's no plot moving forward, and it's frustrating. And that kind of comes in the same thing with Matt, who's kind of on the other end of this, where, Matt is also seeing how the system fails people. We get that guy at the beginning of the episode who gets, arrested for stealing caramel corn, and we see how Matt sort of like working within the system, making deals, like talking this girl down to like, only gets 10 days in jail, and he's like, you need to accept that, like, you're not going to get probation, you're going to go to jail, like 10 days is a miracle because you did steal. And we get these moments where this Leroy, the guy who got arrested, says, the cops stole too. They didn't get any, they didn't get arrested, even though they stole the same caramel corn I did, and that's how the system rewards them. And also he's like, hey, look, and this really the scene I really like, the music is a bit much, even though it's like the Daredevil Born Again theme. It's like, it's a little melodramatic, but it's trying to make this point of like, this guy's like, yeah, I just wanted dessert to feel good, because I've been dealing with all this bullshit, and the system keeps pushing me down, and now they're going to give me 10 days, and I'm going to lose all these benefits that I've had and just need and have to rely upon, and I'm just going to get constantly thrown into this system. And he's right about how the system sort of keeps people in their different positions. And again, we're getting Matt sort of seeing it less from the side of like, I want to do these things, because I just want to like have the ability to do these things, whereas like how it sort of systemically keeps people down. So it's like a similar feeling that Matt feels of this frustration with the system, but put towards a more altruistic goal than sort of the more I don't even want to say, I guess, authoritarian goals with Fisk. Even though Fisk's goals are altruistic, they're still authoritarian. He just wants to do things. And I love that. I love this analysis of systems and how they incentivize people to sort of like want to be authoritarian or be more altruistic, and how both of those same impulses can go in two different directions because of the way the system works. Again, as an anarchist, if you followed my politics elsewhere on the internet, like, I'm an anarchist, and I am honestly someone who is very much against, systems that consolidate hierarchical power in institutions and do so in a way that tries to uphold the institutional power without enabling actual people, but how that incentivizes people to take advantage of it or not. So that's interesting discussions of it for me, and I love the episode for doing that, and even putting it on cops in this show. But it's ultimately, again, it's like, where are we going? And the only push forward we get plot-wise with Matt is he starts to look into the killing of Hector Ayala, which I loved that scene where we sort of get the perspective of him, listening to noise, going investigating the sounds, all that stuff, which ultimately brings him to find the bullet with the Punisher logo on it, and leading him to, spoiler alert for the episode, us getting John Bernthal, who I love, back as Punisher here. And him talking to him and having this conversation with him about, like, John Bernthal's like, oh yeah, you could be really pushing Matt to be like, yeah, you trusted in the system, you believed in it, and yet the guy who did the harm to your friend who killed Froggy is just sitting there and living living life. You could have killed him. You could have put an end to it. And, you know, I even love that point that Leroy says they're willing to spend more money on putting me away than feeding me food. And they're doing the same kind of for Bullseye. Like, you know, could just end his life and you don't have to pay for him. And I'm not saying that's correct, but I am saying that there's that interesting interrogation of like Matt trusting the system over like his own individual choices. And that's a similar feeling as Fisk wants. Like Matt just wants, like, there's a feeling is like, I need to hold myself back as Daredevil because if I make those unilateral choices, I could end up like Fisk, who wants to make unilateral choices too. So it's like they're both constraining themselves in similar ways for different reasons, but ultimately like with the same sort of like goal of, do we just unilaterally choose to kill people? And what holds us back for that? Is it some higher morals, like, you know, Christian God that Matt sometimes follows? Or is it a system that holds us to these things? Do we have a morals that we hold ourselves to, like Foggy necessarily would? Interesting questions. But ultimately, like, the only thing, and I love the idea of, you know, Frank bringing up this point of, like, oh, yeah, they're fanboys of the cops, are sort of, you know, loving me, like, fanboys of me, even though they don't really understand me. And I wish we got a more interrogation of that, because there's so much there of, like, the cops in real life who venerate the Punisher without understanding, like, how the Punisher would hate them, even though you know, the Punisher is someone who does take those unilateral actions to just kill people, even though his level of his moral system is, you know, different and complex. Read the comics, there's a lot going on with there, but like he would not like those cops who just sort of use it to uphold them, you know, upholding power of the system, protecting themselves. So all those are interesting questions I wish the show would interrogate more, but also in a more plot forward way that we don't get here. And I think that that's ultimately where I'm coming down on this episode. I like a lot of the ideas that it is playing with, that it is going through the character studies that it is doing. And, you know, I am not necessarily someone who's like, oh, plot. I always need more plot. But there's no central drive to this show right now, whether it be in microcosm or macrocosm, that I'm just sort of like, where are we ultimately going? And I know we're getting little hints, like Hush showing up. He's killing people and he's got his mask. You know, I that's what I get from him. And I'm just sort of like, but what is ultimately the goal of this series of where are we pushing forward? And because we don't have that momentum, I'm sort of like, all of these ideas are interesting. And I think you're playing with cool stuff. And I like the stuff that you're dealing with. But what are we doing? And I ultimately am worried about this show just being, because, you know, I've talked about it before, the show being a rejiggered show from whatever the initial vision was. They reshot episode 1 in the last 2 episodes of the season, then re-edited and reshot some stuff for the rest of the season. And I wonder if that sort of realignment of the show has cut a lot of the plot elements that the show was going to be building towards. Because maybe, and again, this is just me speculating, Marvel didn't want them to really question the system in the way that the show was doing, and are recontextualizing to like cut away some of the more political elements of the show that I think clearly are here to try and give a little bit more streamlined narrative to pull away from that fact. That's just me speculating. Maybe that's not the case. Maybe you know, the plot did suck and this is a better version. But I ultimately wonder if that's the case, if we're just getting a stripped down version of this narrative that is kind of pulling back on some of these more interesting ideas to just kind of like leave it sort of more aimless in the plot, and they're sort of rejiggering the plot as it goes along later on. I don't know. In like the last 2 episodes will be like, oh, here's all finally the plot we didn't get to because we cut it out of all the other things. We reshot these episodes. Now here's the plot, and we'll finish up. That's me speculating. So put a no grain of salt into that, or put a little grain of salt into any of that thought. But it ultimately leads into questions like where's the show going? And I wonder if it's ultimately a part of the re-edits, that's reworking of the show, that this show feels a little bit aimless, regardless of the intent behind the refiguration of the show. Like, there is clearly an aimlessness happening right now, and I wonder where that comes from, but it feels like it comes from the fact that they changed up the show. And as a result, I sit here in this stew of interesting ideas and themes without feeling like, all right, I'm excited to see where this is going. Like, I'm excited to see what ideas they explore, but I wish I was excited about the plot. I wish I was excited about what the show was actually doing with these ideas and evolving these ideas. Now, again, we'll see what happens in the next few episodes of the show. It could completely radically change my mind on it, but as we sit at episode 4, it feels like we're so far into the show and I still don't have a sense of direction, and I really want that. So that's my thoughts on episode 4 of Daredevil Born Again. What did you think about it? I enjoyed it overall thematically, but we'll see where it goes plot-wise. And I will talk to you next week. Until then, live long and prosper, my friends.